The crack of a pistol shot echoed across the plains as Grace Vaughn ducked behind the wagon wheel, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild Mustang. This wasn't how her life was supposed to end. 23 years old, covered in dust, and fleeing the only home she'd known for the past 5 years. Nebraska Territory, 1865. The war had ended, but Grace's troubles were just beginning. 5 years of loyal service to the Hollister family in their grand home outside of Kearney, Nebraska Territory, had earned her nothing but accusations and contempt. Mrs. Hollister's diamond brooch had gone missing, and despite Grace's protests of innocence, the lady of the house had declared her guilty. "Thieving little wretch," Mrs. Hollister had screamed that morning, her face twisted with rage as she threw Grace's meager belongings into a tattered carpetbag. "After all we've done for you." All they'd done was work her from dawn until well past dusk for scraps of food and a cramped attic room where the roof leaked during rainstorms. The promised wages had dwindled over the years to almost nothing, always with some excuse about hard times or extra expenses. "But I didn't take it, Mrs. Hollister. I swear on my mother's grave," Grace had pleaded, her hands trembling. "Your word means nothing. A girl with your background orphaned, penniless, of course you'd resort to stealing." Mr. Hollister had appeared in the doorway, his hunting rifle casually propped against his shoulder. "You'll leave today. If you're found in Kearney after sunset, I'll have the sheriff arrest you." And so Grace had found herself walking away from the Hollister estate with nothing but her carpetbag, the clothes on her back, and $3.47 hidden in the hem of her dress savings she'd managed to squirrel away over 5 long years. She'd made it 10 miles west of town when she heard the horses. 3 riders, dust billowing behind them, and leading the charge was Mr. Hollister himself, his face red with fury even at a distance. "There she is," he'd shouted. "The thief." That's when the first shot rang out, kicking up dirt near her feet. Whether he meant to hit her or merely frighten her, Grace didn't stay to find out. She'd scrambled off the main trail and hidden behind an abandoned wagon, praying they would pass her by. "We know you took it, girl." Hollister called out, "Make this easy on yourself." Grace pressed herself against the rotting wood, willing her breathing to quiet. She wasn't a thief. The brooch had likely been misplaced by Mrs. Hollister herself, who was forever forgetting where she left her jewels after too much sherry in the evenings. But it didn't matter. The Hollisters had power in Kearney, and Grace had nothing but her word. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her blood run cold. They were coming closer, circling the wagon. She needed to run, but where? The open prairie offered no shelter, no place to hide. A shadow fell across her hiding spot. "Well now, what do we have here?" A deep voice, unfamiliar, not one of her pursuers. Grace looked up, squinting against the harsh sunlight. A man sat atop a chestnut stallion, his face obscured by the wide brim of his hat. All she could make out was a strong jawline and the glint of curious eyes. "Please," she whispered, "they'll kill me." The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, moving with the easy grace of someone who spent most of his life on horseback. He crouched beside her, and she could see him clearly now, young, perhaps 26 or 27, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Who's after you, miss?" His voice was low, tinged with a slight southern drawl. Before Grace could answer, another shot rang out, splintering wood above their heads. "That would be them," she said, ducking lower. The stranger's expression hardened. In one swift movement, he stood and drew his revolver. "Stay down," he instructed, then stepped out from behind the wagon. "Gentlemen," he called out, "I believe you're trespassing on private property." "This doesn't concern you, Cowboy," came Hollister's reply. "The girl's a thief. We're bringing her to justice." 3 armed men chasing one unarmed woman. The stranger's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Doesn't look like justice to me." Grace peered around the wagon wheel. The stranger stood tall, his stance relaxed but alert, facing down Hollister and his 2 companions, the stable master and Mr. Hollister's cousin, both men she recognized from town. She stole my wife's diamond brooch, Hollister insisted. Worth more than you'll see in a decade, cowpoke. The stranger didn't flinch. Then take it up with the law in town. Last I checked, firing shots at fleeing women wasn't legal, even in Nebraska. Hollister raised his rifle. Step aside, boy. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Grace watched, breath caught in her throat as the standoff stretched. 3 against 1, terrible odds by any measure. Then the stranger did something unexpected. He laughed. You boys picked the wrong day. He gestured with his free hand, and for the first time, Grace noticed the cattle in the distance, and the riders watching from a ridge, at least a dozen of them. My outfit's driving 2,000 head to Kansas City. Those men up there, they don't take kindly to folks threatening their trail boss. Hollister's face paled visibly. He lowered his rifle slowly. The girl's coming with us, the stranger continued, his voice level but brooking no argument. You have a complaint, take it to the marshal in the next town, but this hunt ends now. For a moment, Grace thought Hollister would fight anyway. His face twisted with rage, hands gripping the rifle so tight his knuckles showed white. But then his gaze flickered to the distant cowboys and whatever courage he had drained away. This isn't over, Hollister spat, but he was already turning his horse. She's marked now, no one in Kearney will help her. The 3 men rode off, dust swirling in their wake, and Grace felt her legs give way beneath her. She slumped against the wagon wheel, the full weight of her situation crashing down. Homeless, penniless, accused of a crime she didn't commit, where could she go? What could she do, they gone? The stranger asked, holstering his revolver and kneeling beside her. Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Name's Yates Cooper, he said, offering a calloused hand. Trail boss for the Bar None outfit. Grace Vaughn, she managed, taking his hand briefly. And thank you, Mr. Cooper, I believe you just saved my life. Call me Yates. He studied her for a moment, those storm-gray eyes taking in her plain dress, worn boots, and the small carpet bag clutched in her lap. Want to tell me what that was really about? You don't look like a jewel thief to me. Grace explained quickly her position as a maid, the missing brooch, the accusations. Yates listened without interruption, his expression grave. I swear I didn't take it, she finished. But it doesn't matter now. I can't go back to Kearney and I have nowhere else to go. Yates nodded slowly. Cattle drives heading to Abilene. It's a long journey, but we could use a cook's helper. Our current one's about as skilled as my horse at making biscuits. A slight smile softened his features. Pays fair and you'd have protection along the way. Grace stared at him, stunned by the offer. Join a cattle drive? Women rarely traveled with such outfits. It would be scandalous in normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, and beggars couldn't be choosers. I can cook, she said finally, and I'm not afraid of hard work. Good, Yates replied, standing and extending his hand to help her up. Because there's plenty of both ahead. As he lifted her to her feet, Grace felt the strangest sensation, like stepping off a cliff and finding solid ground beneath her instead of the expected fall. This man, this cowboy she'd known for less than 10 minutes, had just offered her a lifeline when she'd been drowning. Why are you helping me? She asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. Life had taught her that kindness usually came with conditions. Yates shrugged, already leading his horse back toward her. My ma was accused of something she didn't do once. Nobody stood up for her. A shadow passed over his face. I reckon the world could use more people willing to help strangers. He offered her a boost onto his horse. Camp's about a mile west. We'll find you a wagon to ride in for the journey. As Grace settled onto the saddle, Yates walking beside, leading the horse by the reins, she cast one last glance at the road to Kearney. 5 years of her life gone in an instant. She had no idea what lay ahead, but for the first time since the Hollisters had thrown her out, she felt something stir in her chest. Hope. The cattle drive camp sprawled across a wide meadow beside a shallow creek, a temporary city of men, beasts, and equipment. Grace had never seen anything like it. 30 cowboys moving with purpose. checking equipment, tending to horses, and preparing for the long journey ahead. Cookfires dotted the landscape, and the massive herd of longhorn cattle grazed a short distance away, their impressive horns gleaming in the late afternoon sun. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Yates remarked, noting her wide-eyed expression. "It's overwhelming," Grace admitted. "I've never seen so many cattle in one place." 2,300 head, he said with a hint of pride. "Bound for the railhead at Abilene, then on to Chicago, worth a small fortune if we get them there intact." Cowboys stopped to stare as Yates led Grace through camp. Some tipped their hats respectfully, others merely looked curious. A few cast glances that made Grace uncomfortable, but a sharp look from Yates was enough to make them avert their eyes. They approached a chuck wagon where a rotund man with a salt and pepper beard was cursing colorfully at a pot of bubbling stew. "Cookie," Yates called out, "got a new assistant for you." The cook looked up, surprise evident on his weathered face. "A woman, on a cattle drive." "Have you lost your mind, Yates?" "Probably," Yates replied easily. "But she can cook, and God knows your biscuits are liable to kill a man." The cook huffed indignantly but extended a flour-covered hand toward Grace. "Jeremiah Wilkins, miss, been cooking for Cowboys for nigh on 20 years. "Grace Vaughn," she replied, shaking his hand. "I'm grateful for the opportunity, Mr. Wilkins. Call me Cookie, everyone does." He eyed her speculatively. "Can you make a decent biscuit, the best in 3 counties, or so the Hollisters' guests always said?" Cookie's expression softened slightly. "Well, we'll see about that come morning. You can bunk in the supply wagon at night. I'll make sure nobody bothers you." A tall, lean man with a severe expression approached, eyeing Grace with open disapproval. "What's this, Cooper?" "We're not running a passenger service." "Grace, this is Harrison Wells, the trail owner's representative," Yates introduced. "Mr. Wells, Miss Vaughn will be assisting Cookie for the duration of the drive." "We didn't budget for extra hands," Wells objected, his thin lips pressed into a disapproving line. "She'll work for half wages," Yates countered, "and I guarantee the men's morale will improve with decent food." Wells looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in Yates's stance made him reconsider. "Your responsibility, Cooper. She causes any trouble, any at all, and she's gone. Clear, Crystal," Yates replied evenly. As Wells stalked away, Grace turned to Yates. "I can't accept charity." "If half wages is all I'm worth, you're worth full wages and more," Yates interrupted. "But sometimes you have to compromise to get your foot in the door." He offered a reassuring smile. "Prove yourself useful and Wells will come around. He's a businessman at heart, values anything that helps the bottom line." "I'll earn my keep," Grace promised, lifting her chin determinedly, "and I'll pay you back for helping me." "No need," Yates said. "Just do good work and stay out of trouble. Speaking of which," he glanced around the camp, "I should introduce you to the men. Best they understand you're under my protection." The next hour was a blur of introductions, cowboys with names like Dusty, Slim, and Curly, though Grace noticed most seemed to be nicknames rather than given names. They ranged in age from barely older than her to grizzled veterans who looked like they'd been born in the saddle. Most were polite, if surprised, at her presence. The sun was setting by the time Yates showed her to the supply wagon where she would sleep. "It's not much," he apologized, indicating the small space among crates and barrels, "but it's dry and relatively private." Grace peered inside. After the attic room at the Hollisters, this seemed spacious enough. "It's perfect, thank you." An awkward silence fell between them. "We head out at first light," Yates finally said. "Drive will take about 2 months, weather permitting. It won't be easy, long days, rough terrain, and not much in the way of comfort." "I'm stronger than I look," Grace assured him, "and I'm not afraid of hard work." Yates nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Get some rest. Cookie will wake you before dawn." He hesitated, then added, "I'm glad you're here, Grace. Trail drives can be lonely ventures." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat and strode away, leaving her with a strange fluttering in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or exhaustion. That night, Lying on a makeshift bed of blankets in the supply wagon, listening to the sounds of the camp settling down for the night, men's voices, the lowing of cattle, the occasional whinny of horses, Grace found herself pondering the strange turns her life had taken in a single day. This morning, she had been a maid in a respectable household, with a roof over her head and certainty about tomorrow, if not happiness. Tonight, she was effectively homeless, accused of theft, and throwing her lot in with a group of strangers on a journey of hundreds of miles. And yet, as she drifted towards sleep, Grace realized she felt more free than she had in years. Whatever tomorrow brought, at least she was no longer trapped in the Hollisters' gilded cage. Biscuits? Cookie bellowed at the crack of dawn, rousing Grace from a deep sleep. "Let's see these famous biscuits of yours, girl." Grace scrambled to her feet, quickly splashing water on her face from a basin outside the wagon before hurrying to the chuck wagon. Cookie had already stoked the fire and laid out the ingredients: flour, lard, salt, and a jug of buttermilk. "Men need feeding before we move out," he explained gruffly. "Breakfast's the most important meal on a cattle drive. Get it wrong and they'll be miserable all day." Grace nodded, already rolling up her sleeves. This, at least, was familiar territory. She had cooked countless breakfasts at the Hollister household, often for a dozen or more when they entertained guests. With practiced efficiency, she mixed the dough, taking care not to overwork it, the secret to tender biscuits. Cookie watched with grudging approval as she expertly shaped the rounds and placed them in the Dutch oven. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" he asked, stirring a massive pot of beans with salt pork. "My mother before she died," Grace replied, focusing on her task. "She cooked for a railroad magnate in Omaha, taught me everything she knew." By the time the Cowboys began assembling for breakfast, Grace had produced 4 dozen golden brown biscuits, a skillet of crisp bacon, and was frying eggs to order. The aroma drew appreciative comments from the men, many of whom cast surprised glances at the new addition to the chuck wagon. "These ain't Cookie's biscuits," declared one weathered cowboy after his first bite. "These actually taste good." A ripple of laughter spread through the group, and Cookie huffed in mock offense. "Careful, Dusty, or you'll be eating hardtack for the rest of the drive." Grace worked steadily, serving food and brewing fresh coffee. She noticed Yates hanging back, watching with quiet satisfaction as his men ate with obvious enjoyment. When he finally approached for his own breakfast, their eyes met briefly and something unspoken passed between them. "Good morning," he said, accepting a plate from her hands. "Sleep well." "Better than expected," she replied, "though I'm not used to waking before the sun." "You'll adapt quickly," he assured her, taking a bite of biscuit. His eyebrows rose appreciatively. "These are exceptional." A warm flush of pride spread through Grace's chest at his praise. "Thank you, Cooper." Wells's sharp voice cut through the moment. "We're burning daylight. Get your men moving." Yates nodded, finishing his breakfast quickly. "Duty calls." He lowered his voice, adding, "You've already made an impression. Keep it up." Within the hour, camp had been struck, the chuck wagon packed, and the massive herd of cattle was moving slowly across the prairie. Grace rode in the supply wagon, bouncing uncomfortably as it followed behind the chuck wagon along the uneven ground. From this vantage point, she could see the entire Operation Cowboys positioned around the herd, keeping the animals moving in the right direction, while scouts rode ahead to check the trail. Yates moved throughout it all, seemingly tireless as he rode from one end of the herd to the other, calling out instructions, resolving minor issues before they became problems. Watching him work, Grace couldn't help but be impressed by his natural authority, the way the men respected him without him having to demand it. The first day passed in a blur of dust, heat, and work. When they stopped to make camp that evening, Grace's muscles ached from the constant jostling of the wagon, but she immediately set to helping Cookie prepare the evening meal. Together, they produced a hearty stew, more biscuits, and a simple apple cobbler that earned her approving nods from even the most skeptical cowboys. As darkness fell and the men gathered around the campfires, spinning yarns and playing cards, Grace sat alone by the chuck wagon, mending a tear in her dress. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet, more than she'd ever been able to see from town. "Mind some company." Yates's voice startled her from her reverie. She looked up to find him standing nearby, hat in hand, looking somehow younger without the weight of responsibility he carried during daylight hours. "Please," she said, indicating the space beside her on the wagon step. He settled down, stretching his long legs out before him. For a few moments, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the distant sounds of the cowboys and the occasional lowing of cattle. "Cookie says you're a natural," Yates finally said. "Best helper he's had in years." Grace smiled, pleased by the compliment. "It feels good to be useful." "Were you not before?" he asked. "With the Hollisters?" "Useful, yes. Valued, no." Grace's hands stilled on her mending. "There's a difference." Yates nodded thoughtfully. "That there is." Another silence fell between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something about Yates Cooper that put her at ease, despite the short time she'd known him. "You said your mother was accused of something she didn't do," Grace ventured, curious about the man who had come to her rescue. "What happened?" A shadow crossed Yates's face, and for a moment Grace thought he wouldn't answer. But then he sighed, gazing out at the darkened prairie. "I was 13, he began. "We lived in Missouri near the Kansas border. My pa had a small horse ranch, not much, but it was ours." His voice took on a faraway quality. "When the war broke out, things got complicated. Border region, divided loyalties. My pa refused to take sides, said he just wanted to raise horses and be left alone." Grace watched his profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw tightening as he continued. "Militia came through one night. Said someone had informed on their movements to the other side. They accused my mother she was from Kentucky originally, had family with Southern sympathies." His hands clenched into fists. "They didn't wait for proof, burned our barn, shot our horses. Pa tried to stop them and they—" He trailed off, the memory clearly still painful. "I'm so sorry," Grace whispered, instinctively reaching out to touch his arm. Yates nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. "Mother and I fled west afterward. She never recovered from losing Pa, died of pneumonia 2 winters later. I was 15, worked as a ranch hand until I learned enough to move up." A slight smile touched his lips. "Now I'm trail boss for one of the biggest outfits in the territory." "Your parents would be proud," Grace said softly. "Maybe." Yates turned to look at her directly. "What about you? You mentioned your mother taught you to cook before she died." Grace nodded, appreciating his effort to shift the conversation. "She passed when I was 17. Fever took her quick. My father had died years earlier in a factory accident in Omaha." She smoothed her skirt with careful hands. "I had no other family, no money for passage back east where my mother's people lived. The Hollisters offered me a position and I was grateful at the time." 5 years is a long time to stay somewhere you weren't valued," Yates observed. Grace shrugged. "Security is powerful motivation when you have nowhere else to go." She looked up at the star-filled sky. "I kept thinking if I just worked harder, proved myself more useful, they might see me as a person rather than property." "And now?" Yates asked. "Now I'm beginning to think perhaps being cast out was the best thing that could have happened to me," Grace admitted. Frightening as it was at the time. Yates studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You're a remarkable woman, Grace Vaughn." Before she could respond, a commotion erupted from the cattle heard bellowing and the sound of hooves. Yates was on his feet in an instant. "Stay here," he ordered, already striding toward his horse. Men scrambled to respond as Yates shouted commands, mounting up and riding toward the disturbance. Grace watched anxiously as lanterns bobbed in the darkness, illuminating running figures. "Wolves," Cookie explained, appearing beside her with a shotgun in his hands. "They smell the herd, get bold sometimes. Don't you worry, the boys will handle it." True to his word, the commotion subsided within half an hour. When Yates returned, there was a long tear in his shirt sleeve and a smear of blood on his forearm. "You're hurt," Grace exclaimed, immediately moving toward him. "It's nothing," he dismissed. "Caught myself on a branch." "Let me see," she insisted, taking his arm and examining the cut in the lantern light. It wasn't deep but needed cleaning. Without asking permission, she led him to the chuck wagon where Cookie kept medical supplies. Yates submitted to her ministrations with surprising docility as she washed the wound with whiskey and wrapped it with a clean bandage. "Thank you," he said when she finished, his voice low. Their faces were close in the lantern light, close enough that Grace could see flecks of blue in his gray eyes. For a heartbeat, something electric passed between them, a possibility, unspoken but undeniable. Then Cookie called for Yates, breaking the moment. "Get some rest," Yates told her, standing up. "Tomorrow's another long day." As he walked away, Grace touched her fingers to her flushed cheeks. What was happening to her? She couldn't be developing feelings for this man she barely knew, could she? It was gratitude, nothing more, appreciation for his kindness and protection. Yet as she prepared for sleep that night, Grace couldn't help but replay their conversation, the way his eyes had held hers, the unexpected gentleness in his calloused hands. For the first time since leaving Kearney, her thoughts weren't consumed by worry about her future. Instead, they dwelled on the mysterious trail boss with storm-gray eyes and a sad history that mirrored her own. The days fell into a rhythm as the cattle drive pushed steadily southward. Grace adapted quickly to life on the trail, waking before dawn, helping Cookie prepare meals, washing dishes in streams and rivers they crossed, mending clothes for cowboys who sheepishly approached with torn shirts and missing buttons. The work was hard, the conditions primitive, but Grace found herself thriving. There was a simple honesty to this life that she hadn't experienced with the Hollisters, where every interaction was layered with unspoken expectations and rigid social hierarchies. Here, her worth was measured by her contributions, not her station. The cowboys, initially skeptical of having a woman in camp, had quickly come to appreciate her cooking and her quiet efficiency. They treated her with a rough respect that felt more genuine than all the polite nods she'd received, as the Hollisters Maid. A week into the journey, they encountered their first major obstacle, a swollen river, its normally fordable waters made treacherous by recent rains. "We'll have to wait it out," Wells argued as he, Yates, and the senior cowboys assessed the situation. "Lose 100 head trying to cross now, and the drive's not profitable?" "Waiting costs us time we don't have," Yates countered, studying the rushing water with a critical eye. "There's a narrow section upriver about 2 miles. Banks are steeper, but the crossing's shorter." "Too risky," Wells insisted. Grace watched the exchange from where she was gathering water for the cooking pots. The decision wasn't hers, but she found herself silently supporting Yates's position. In the short time she'd known him, she'd come to trust his judgment. "I've crossed higher water than this," Yates said firmly. "We'll send riders ahead to guide the herd. The cattle will follow if we get the leaders moving." In the end, Yates's authority as trail boss prevailed. The drive redirected to the narrower crossing he'd identified, and Grace watched with a mixture of anxiety and admiration as Yates personally led the operation. He and 4 experienced cowboys rode into the rushing water, establishing a line that would guide the cattle across. The next hours were tense as the massive herd was urged into the river. Some animals balked at the water's edge, others were swept downstream despite the cowboys' best efforts. Grace found herself holding her breath as Yates repeatedly crossed the dangerous waters, retrieving strays and encouraging stragglers. By late afternoon, the majority of the herd had made it across, with surprisingly few losses. The chuck wagon and supply wagon came last, the teams of oxen straining against the current. Grace clung to the wagon seat as water sloshed over the floorboards, soaking her skirts. For one terrifying moment, the wagon seemed to teeter on the edge of being swept away, then strong hands were guiding the oxen, and Yates's voice called encouragement. "Almost there," he shouted above the rush of water. "Keep steady." When they finally reached the opposite bank, Grace was shaking with cold and delayed fear. Yates appeared beside the wagon, water streaming from his clothes and hat. "You all right?" he asked, his eyes searching hers with genuine concern. Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. On impulse, she reached out and squeezed his hand in silent thanks. That evening, as the camp recovered from the day's excitement, a subtle shift occurred in the dynamic between Grace and Yates. He sought her out during the quiet moments, sharing small observations about the journey or asking her opinion on minor decisions. She found herself watching for his return when he rode out with the scouts, inexplicably anxious until she saw him reappear on the horizon. "You're sweet on the boss," Cookie remarked one evening as they prepared supper, his tone matter-of-fact rather than teasing. Grace nearly dropped the pot she was stirring. "I don't know what you mean," Cookie chuckled, a knowing twinkle in his eye. "Been on drives with Cooper for 3 seasons now. Never seen him give a second glance to any woman in the towns we pass through. But he looks at you like a man who's found water after crossing a desert." "He's simply being kind to someone in need," Grace protested, though her heart quickened at Cookie's words. "If that's what helps you sleep at night," Cookie replied with a shrug. "But take it from an old man who's seen his share of life, there's something growing between you two, sure as spring follows winter." Grace said nothing, but that night, when Yates joined her by the fire after the other men had turned in, she couldn't help but view their interaction through the lens of Cookie's observation. Was there something in the way Yates smiled at her? Did his hand linger when he passed her a cup of coffee? "Penny for your thoughts," Yates said, noticing her distraction. "I was just thinking about how different my life is now compared to 2 weeks ago," she replied truthfully if incompletely. "Regrets?" he asked, his expression carefully neutral. Grace considered the question honestly. She'd gone from a clean, orderly life with regular meals and a roof overhead to dusty days on the trail, sleeping in a wagon and working from dawn until dusk. "Not a single one," she answered, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Yates's smile was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. "Glad to hear it." As the days passed, their evening conversations became a cherished ritual. Grace learned that Yates had taught himself to read using old newspapers and discarded books, that he could identify every constellation in the night sky, that he dreamed of someday having his own ranch in Colorado Territory, where the mountains met the plains. In turn, she shared stories of her childhood in Omaha, her mother's recipes, her secret desire to see the ocean someday. Small confidences exchanged in the quiet hours while the camp slept around them, building a bridge of understanding between their worlds. The trail drive continued southward, crossing into Kansas Territory as May gave way to June. The days grew hotter, the work more challenging, but Grace found a strength within herself she hadn't known existed. Her hands grew calloused, her skin tanned, and the fine ladies Maid from Kearney slowly transformed into a capable woman of the frontier. One evening, as they made camp near a small creek, Yates approached with an unusual request. "Some of the men spotted a wild apple tree about a mile back," he said. "Would you like to ride out with me and gather some? Might make a nice treat for supper." The invitation to leave camp, just the two of them, carried implications that made Grace's pulse quicken. It would be the first time they'd been truly alone, away from the watchful eyes of the cowboys and Cookie's knowing glances. "I'd like that," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. Yates helped her mount his spare horse, a gentle mare named Willow, and they rode out together as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Grace reveled in the sensation of freedom as they cantered across the open prairie, the wind in her hair and Yates riding beside her. The apple tree stood alone on a small rise, gnarled and ancient but bearing fruit that was small and tart, perfect for cooking. They dismounted, and Grace held a sack open while Yates reached for the higher branches. My mother would have loved these for her famous apple dumplings, Grace remarked, examining one of the fruits. She always said the wild ones had more flavor. She sounds like a remarkable woman, Yates replied, stretching to reach a particularly fine specimen. She was. Grace smiled at the memory. Strong but gentle too, never let hardship make her bitter. She glanced up at Yates. You remind me of her in that way. Yates paused, looking down at her with an expression that made her breath catch. That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. They worked in companionable silence until the sack was full. As Yates secured it to his saddle, a distant rumble of thunder made both of them look up. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, moving quickly in their direction. Storm's coming, Yates observed, frowning. We should head back. They mounted quickly, but the weather moved faster than anticipated. Within minutes, the sky had darkened ominously, and fat drops of rain began to fall. By the time they'd covered half the distance back to camp, the downpour was in full force. There. Yates pointed to a small copse of trees that offered some shelter. We'll wait it out. They dismounted beneath the largest tree, its leafy canopy providing minimal protection from the deluge. Grace was already soaked through, her hair plastered to her face, dress clinging to her form. Sorry about this, Yates shouted over the roar of the rain, pulling off his coat and attempting to hold it over her head. Grace laughed, the sound bright against the storm's backdrop. It's just water, I won't melt, Yates grinned, lowering the coat. No, I don't suppose you will. They stood close together, backs against the tree trunk, watching the spectacular display of nature's fury. Lightning forked across the sky, followed by crashes of thunder that Grace could feel in her chest. It's beautiful, she said during a momentary lull. Terrifying but beautiful. Yes, Yates replied, but when Grace turned to look at him, she found he wasn't watching the storm at all. He was watching her, his eyes filled with an intensity that made her forget the cold and the wet. Grace, he said, his voice barely audible above the rain. I think I'm falling in love with you. The words hung between them, impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. Grace felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet, yet somehow she remained standing. Yates, she began, unsure what to say, how to respond to a declaration that both thrilled and terrified her. You don't have to say anything, he rushed on. I know it's too soon, that we barely know each other. But I've never met anyone like you, so brave, so determined, so kind despite everything life's thrown at you. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. Was this real? Could she trust these feelings that had developed so quickly? I've been alone for a long time, Yates continued, his normally confident demeanor giving way to vulnerability. Never thought I'd find someone who made me want to be more than I am. Then you appeared, hiding behind that wagon wheel, and everything changed. The rain continued to fall around them, creating a private world where only the two of them existed. Grace reached up, touching his cheek with trembling fingers. I'm afraid, she admitted softly. Of me? Concern flooded his features. No, she shook her head. Of feeling this much, this quickly, of trusting that something this unexpected could be real. Yates covered her hand with his own, keeping it pressed against his face. It scares me too, he confessed, but I think the best things in life often do. The honesty in his eyes undid her. Standing on tiptoe, Grace pressed her lips to his in a kiss that started tentatively but quickly deepened as Yates responded, his arms encircling her waist and drawing her closer. The world narrowed to the feeling of his mouth on hers, the solid strength of his chest against her palms, the thundering of her heart that matched the storm raging around them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, staring at each other with wonder. That was. Yates began. Unexpected, Grace suggested, a smile tugging at her lips. Perfect, he corrected, tucking a strand of wet hair behind her ear. The rain began to let up, the storm moving eastward as quickly as it had arrived. Sunlight broke through the clouds, casting everything in a golden glow. We should get back, Grace said reluctantly. Cookie will be worried. Yates nodded, but before he helped her mount, he pulled her close for one more kiss. "This isn't just the storm talking," he murmured against her lips. "I want you to know that." "I do," she replied and realized she meant it. Whatever was happening between them felt more real than anything she'd experienced before. As they rode back to camp, side by side in comfortable silence, Grace marveled at how dramatically her life had changed in just 2 weeks. Cast out with nothing, she had somehow found something precious beyond measure, the beginning of love with a man who saw her true worth. The remainder of the journey to Abilene passed in a blur of long days, starlit nights, and moments stolen with Yates whenever duty allowed. Their growing relationship was the worst-kept secret in camp. The cowboys exchanged knowing glances when Yates sought Grace out after supper, and Cookie took to conveniently finding tasks that required his attention elsewhere during their evening conversations. Even Harrison Wells, perpetually concerned with the business aspects of the drive, seemed to soften his initial disapproval. Grace overheard him remarking to one of the senior cowboys that the men's morale had improved markedly since her arrival. "Never seen a happier outfit," the cowboy had agreed. "Good food and the boss in good spirits makes for smooth trailing." As they drew closer to Abilene, however, an unspoken question hung between Grace and Yates. What would happen when the drive ended? Grace had signed on as cook's helper for the journey, but beyond that, her future remained uncertain. Yates was contracted for 2 more cattle drives before the season ended. Would he expect her to wait for him? And where? These questions weighed heavily on Grace's mind the night they made camp within sight of Abilene. The distant lights of the town glimmered on the horizon, promising civilization after weeks on the trail. Tomorrow they would deliver the herd to the railhead, the cowboys would receive their pay, and the drive would officially end. "Walk with me," Yates asked after supper, extending his hand. Grace took it, allowing him to lead her away from camp to a small hillock overlooking the prairie they had crossed. The moon was full, bathing the landscape in silver light and making the tall grass ripple like water in the gentle breeze. "Hard to believe we made it," Grace remarked, gazing back the way they had come. "All those miles, all those obstacles." "We make a good team," Yates replied, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "The men are calling this the smoothest drive they've ever experienced." "Cookie deserves most of the credit," Grace demurred. "He's the one who taught me trail cooking. It's more than that." Yates turned to face her fully. "You brought something to this outfit that was missing, a kind of grace, for lack of a better word." He smiled at the unintentional pun. "The men noticed. I certainly did." Grace felt her cheeks warm at his praise. Over the past weeks she'd grown more comfortable with his compliments, but they still affected her deeply. "Abilene tomorrow," she said, voicing the concern that had been troubling her. "What happens then, Yates?" He took a deep breath, seeming to gather his courage. "That depends on you, Grace." "On me?" she echoed, confused. Yates nodded, taking both her hands in his. "I'm contracted for 2 more drives this season, one to Wichita in July, another to Abilene in September after that." He hesitated. "After that, I have enough saved to put a down payment on land in Colorado Territory." "Good land with water rights and timber." Grace's heart quickened. "Your ranch, our ranch," he corrected softly, "if you want it to be." For a moment, Grace couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Was he suggesting what she thought he was? "Yates Cooper," she finally managed. "Are you asking me to marry you?" Even in the moonlight, she could see the flush that crept up his neck. "Not doing a very good job of it, am I?" He cleared his throat. "Yes, Grace Vaughn, I am asking you to be my wife. To build a life together in Colorado, to face whatever comes our way as partners." Joy bubbled up inside her, so intense it was almost painful. "But we've only known each other for 6 weeks, she said, needing to be certain he had considered everything. 6 weeks on the trail is like 6 years in town, Yates replied. We've faced hardships together, seen each other at our worst and our best. I know your heart, Grace, and you know mine. His eyes held her steadily. I love you. I think I started falling the moment you looked up at me from behind that wagon wheel. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of happiness. "I love you too," she whispered. "And yes, Yates Cooper, I will marry you." His face lit up with such joy that Grace's heart felt too full to contain her emotions. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed with delight. "When?" she asked when he finally set her down. "After your last drive in September." "Sooner," Yates decided. "We'll marry in Abilene tomorrow if you're willing. Then you can accompany me on the July drive as my wife, not as a hired hand." "Tomorrow," Grace's eyes widened. "So soon?" "Unless you want to wait," he amended quickly. "I don't want to rush you." Grace considered it only briefly. What was there to wait for? She had no family to consult, no trousseau to prepare. And the idea of being Yates's wife, of facing whatever came next together, filled her with a sense of rightness she couldn't deny. "Tomorrow it is," she agreed with a smile that rivaled the moon for brightness. Their announcement at breakfast the next morning was met with cheers and good-natured teasing from the Cowboys. Cookie pretended outrage at losing his assistant, but couldn't maintain it in the face of their obvious happiness. Even Harrison Wells offered grudging congratulations, along with an unexpected wedding gift and extra week's wages for Grace's contribution to the drive's success. Abilene in 1865 was a booming cattle town, a place where the civilized East met the Wild West in a clash of cultures. Streets that had been quiet farming community lanes just a few years earlier now bustled with cowboys, cattle buyers, saloon girls, and merchants eager to separate the trail hands from their hard-earned pay. Grace and Yates rode into town with the chuck wagon, leaving the herd under the capable supervision of Dusty and the other senior cowboys. They made an odd wedding party, the bride in her travel-stained dress, the only one she owned, the groom in his best shirt still bearing traces of trail dust despite his best efforts, accompanied by Cookie and Harrison Wells as witnesses. The local minister, accustomed to performing hasty ceremonies for cowboys passing through, asked few questions beyond confirming they were both of age and entering the union of their own free will. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt, conducted in the small white church at the edge of town. "I, Yates, take thee Grace," he vowed, his voice steady and sure as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger purchased that morning from the town jeweler with part of his trail boss bonus. "I, Grace, take thee Yates," she responded, marveling at how right the words felt on her lips. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Yates kissed her with such tenderness that Grace felt tears spring to her eyes once more. They signed the marriage certificate with Cookie and Wells as witnesses, and just like that, Grace Vaughn became Grace Cooper. "Congratulations, Mrs. Cooper," Yates whispered as they left the church, the late morning sunlight bathing them in gold. "Mrs. Cooper." The name settled around her shoulders like a warm shawl, comforting and right. For a woman who had been cast out with nothing just 6 weeks earlier, she now possessed everything that truly mattered: love, purpose, and the promise of a future with the man beside her. The Cowboys insisted on throwing an impromptu celebration at one of the more respectable establishments in town. They pooled their resources to rent a private dining room, and Cookie collaborated with the local cook to produce a wedding feast that, while not elaborate, was filled with good cheer and better company. Toasts were made, stories told, and more than one cowboy discreetly wiped away a tear when Yates spoke of finding unexpected treasure on what he had thought would be an ordinary cattle drive. "To the boss and his lady," Dusty proposed, raising his glass high. "May your life together be as smooth as our trail was with you both leading the way." "Hear, hear," came the enthusiastic response. As the evening progressed, Grace found a quiet moment to slip away from the festivities. She stood on the small balcony outside the dining room, gazing up at the stars that had become so familiar during their journey. "Happy?" Yates asked, joining her and wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly, leaning back against his chest. If someone had told me 6 weeks ago that I'd be standing here as your wife, I would have thought them mad. Yates chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her back. Life has a way of surprising us. Indeed it does. Grace turned in his embrace to face him. The Hollisters thought they were ruining my life when they cast me out. Instead, they sent me straight to you. Their loss, my gain, Yates murmured, brushing a soft kiss against her forehead. Though I still don't like how they treated you. Accusing an innocent woman of theft, it's unconscionable. Grace had almost forgotten about the missing diamond brooch that had precipitated her flight from Kearney. It seemed like something from another lifetime belonging to a different Grace entirely. It doesn't matter anymore, she said. Whatever happens, we face it together now. Yates's smile was tender as he cupped her face in his hands. Together, he agreed, always. That night, in a modest room above the town's best hotel, another wedding gift from the Cowboys, Grace and Yates consummated their marriage with a passion tempered by genuine love and mutual respect. For Grace, who had known only loneliness for so long, the intimacy was a revelation, not just the physical pleasure, but the deep emotional connection that came with giving herself completely to someone who cherished her in return. Afterward, lying in Yates's arms as moonlight spilled through the window, Grace felt a sense of peace she hadn't known since childhood. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and she harbored no illusions that building a life in the Colorado Territory would be easy, they would face them as husband and wife, partners in every sense of the word. "What are you thinking?" Yates asked, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I'm the luckiest woman in Kansas," she replied, pressing a kiss to his chest just above his heart. "Funny," he murmured sleepily. "I was just thinking I'm the luckiest man," Grace smiled in the darkness. From maid to wife, from servitude to partnership, from isolation to love, the journey had been unexpected but perfect in its own way. The summer passed in a whirl of activity and new experiences. Yates's July drive to Wichita proved considerably easier than the first, with Grace riding proudly beside her husband as the trail boss's wife rather than the cook's assistant. Cookie still welcomed her help at the chuck wagon, but now she also assisted Yates with record keeping and occasionally rode out with the scouts when the terrain was favorable. The Cowboys treated her with a blend of respect and protective affection, many of them confiding that having her along made them miss their own sweethearts and families less. She became something of an unofficial counselor for the outfit, listening to troubles, mediating minor disputes, and generally helping to maintain the positive spirit that had characterized their first journey together. By the time they returned to Abilene in late July, Grace and Yates had settled into a comfortable rhythm as husband and wife. The trail life suited them both, the open skies, the sense of purpose, the camaraderie of the outfit. But as they prepared for the final drive of the season, Yates began making plans for their future. "I've received word about a parcel of land near Denver," he told Grace one evening as they sat together on the porch of the boarding house where they were staying between drives. 200 acres with water rights, good grazing, and a small cabin already built. Previous owner had to sell after his wife took ill and they moved back east. Grace listened intently as he described their potential new home. "It sounds perfect," she said when he finished. "When can we see it?" "After this last drive," Yates replied. "We'll head straight to Colorado from Abilene in October. If the land meets our expectations, we can close the deal before winter sets in." The prospect filled Grace with excitement. A home of their own, not just any home, but one they would build together, far from the shadows of her past in Kearney. As August faded into September and the final cattle drive began, Grace found herself experiencing an unexpected bout of nausea in the mornings. At first, she attributed it to something she'd eaten, but when the pattern continued for several days, a new possibility presented itself. She confided in Cookie, who had become something of a surrogate father figure during their travels. "Been wondering when you'd figure it out," the old cook said with a knowing smile. Seen it before that glow you've got, the morning sickness. You're carrying the boss's child, sure as I'm standing here. Grace's hands flew to her still flat stomach, a mixture of joy and trepidation washing over her. A baby. Their baby. She and Yates had spoken of children, of course, but somehow she hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Should I tell him right away? She asked Cookie anxiously. The drive's only just begun. I don't want him worrying about me for the entire journey. Cookie considered this, stirring a pot of beans as he thought. Man has a right to know he's going to be a father, he finally said, and Cooper's not the type to wrap you in cotton wool. He respects your strength. It's one of the things he loves most about you. That evening, when Yates returned from checking on the herd, Grace met him with barely contained excitement. They walked a short distance from camp, to a small rise overlooking the peaceful cattle. I have news, she began, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts. Yates looked at her with concern. Everything all right, more than all right, Grace assured him, taking his hand and placing it over her abdomen. We're going to have a baby, Yates. For a moment he stood frozen, his expression blank with shock. Then his face transformed with such pure joy that Grace felt her heart might burst. A baby, he repeated in wonder. Our baby. He whooped suddenly, lifting Grace off her feet and spinning her around before setting her down with exaggerated care as though she might break. When? He asked, his hands gently cradling her face. Early spring, I think, Grace replied. April, perhaps? Yates's smile widened. Perfect timing. We'll be settled in Colorado by then, with a proper home for our little one. His immediate acceptance, his obvious delight, washed away any lingering doubts Grace might have harbored. This man, her husband, her partner, the father of her unborn child, was everything she could have hoped for and more. The remainder of the drive took on a new significance as they traveled south. Every mile brought them closer not just to Abilene, but to the future they would build together in Colorado now as a family of 3. Yates became even more protective, insisting Grace ride in the wagon during rough terrain and making sure she rested whenever possible. The cowboys, once informed of her condition, treated her like precious cargo, bringing her wildflowers they found along the trail and offering their own peculiar brand of advice about child-rearing. When they reached Abilene in early October, the season's final drive completed successfully. A surprise awaited them. As Yates was settling accounts with the cattle buyers, a telegram arrived from Kearney. It's addressed to you, the telegraph operator told Grace when she accompanied Yates to collect their mail. Sent from Nebraska Territory. Grace accepted the paper with trembling hands. No one in Kearney knew where she was who could be contacting her. The message was brief but stunning to Mrs. Grace Cooper, formerly Vaughn, stop diamond brooch found in Mrs. Hollister's jewelry box, stop false accusation confirmed, stop Mr. Hollister extends apologies, and offers compensation, stop please advise where to send funds, stop Sheriff Johnson, Kearney Yates, read the telegram over her shoulder, his expression darkening. Convenient timing, he remarked acidly, after you've been gone for months. But they found it, Grace said, still processing the news. They know I didn't take it. You never did, Yates pointed out. Their acknowledgement doesn't change that fact. Grace nodded slowly. He was right, of course. The Hollisters' belated recognition of her innocence didn't undo the injustice she had suffered, the way they had cast her out without a second thought after 5 years of service. And yet, I want to reply, she decided. Not for them, but for me. To close that chapter completely before we start our new life in Colorado. Yates studied her face, then nodded his understanding. Whatever you need, Grace. They composed the reply together. To Sheriff Johnson, Kearney, Nebraska Territory, stop information received, stop no compensation required, stop best wishes, stop Mrs. Grace Cooper, no compensation. Yates questioned as she prepared to send the message. They owe you for false accusation, lost wages. Grace shook her head, a serene smile touching her lips. They owe me nothing. If they hadn't cast me out, I would never have met you. She placed a hand over her still flat stomach. I would never have found this happiness. Yates's expression softened and he pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. You are a remarkable woman, Grace Cooper. So you keep telling me, she replied with a small laugh. Now let's put Kearney behind us for good and focus on our future. 2 days later, they boarded a train bound for Denver, the first leg of their journey to their new home. Grace had never traveled by rail before, and she marveled at the speed and relative comfort compared to the wagon travel she'd grown accustomed to. Yates watched her excitement with indulgent amusement, pointing out landmarks as they passed and explaining the route they would take once they reached Denver. It's about a day's ride from the city, he told her, unfolding a crude map he'd received from the land agent. Here, along Clear Creek. Good water, good grazing, and the cabin sits on a small rise with views of the mountains. It sounds perfect, Grace said, leaning against him as the train rumbled westward. Cookie had elected to accompany them at least as far as Denver. Too old to start another drive season, he declared. Figured I might find work in one of them Denver hotels. Fancy folks there might appreciate a chef who can cook proper trail food. His presence added to the sense that they were not just starting a new chapter, but bringing the best parts of their past along with them. The journey to Denver took several days, the landscape changing dramatically as they left the plains behind and approached the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Grace pressed her face to the train window, awestruck by the majestic peaks that rose in the distance, their summits already dusted with early October snow. They're beautiful, she breathed, unable to take her eyes off the mountains. Wait until you see them up close, Yates promised, his arm around her shoulders. Clear Creek Valley has the best views in the territory. From Denver, they traveled by stagecoach to the small settlement nearest their land, a growing community called Golden. There, Yates hired horses and a wagon for the final leg of their journey, with Cookie riding alongside on a sturdy mule. As they crested a low hill and the valley opened up before them, Grace gasped. Bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, the landscape was more beautiful than she could have imagined. Rolling meadows dotted with stands of aspen and pine, a clear stream winding through the center, and beyond it all, the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains, sharp against the blue sky. There, Yates said, pointing to a small cabin nestled against a grove of trees. That's it. That's our home. The cabin was modest but solidly built, with a stone chimney and a small covered porch facing the mountains. A corral and barn stood nearby, and a vegetable garden, overgrown now but still showing signs of careful planning, occupied a sunny patch beside the house. As they drew closer, Grace could see that the cabin would need work, shutters hanging crooked, a section of roof that needed repair, a door that didn't quite sit straight in its frame. But these were minor concerns compared to the potential she saw all around her. This was a place where they could build something lasting, something that belonged to them alone. Yates helped her down from the wagon, then swept her into his arms before she could protest. Tradition, he explained with a grin, carrying her across the threshold into what would become their home. Inside, the cabin was simple but spacious enough for their needs: a main room with a hearth, a small bedroom, and a storage area that could easily be converted into a nursery. Previous owners had left behind basic furniture: a table and chairs, a bed frame, shelves built into the walls. "What do you think?" Yates asked, watching her face anxiously as she explored. Grace turned to him, her heart too full for words. Instead, she wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him deeply, trying to convey through touch what she couldn't express in speech. When they finally broke apart, Yates's eyes were shining. "I'll take that as approval," he said, his voice husky. "It's perfect," Grace managed. "It needs work, but it's perfect." Cookie, who had been tactfully exploring the barn, reappeared with a report that the structure was sound and would comfortably house several horses and a milk cow or two. "Root cellar's well built too," he added. Need to stock it before winter sets in, but you've got the makings of a proper homestead here. That first night, they camped in their own front yard, deciding to give the cabin a thorough cleaning before moving in properly. Under the vast Colorado sky, with a campfire crackling and Cookie spinning tall tales of his younger days, Grace felt a contentment that went beyond happiness, a bone-deep sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was meant to be. Later, as she lay beside Yates in their tent, his hand resting protectively over her abdomen where their child grew, Grace reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought her here. "Penny for your thoughts," Yates murmured, echoing a phrase that had become familiar between them. "I was just thinking," Grace replied softly, "about how sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead to the best ones. If the Hollisters hadn't accused me of theft, if they hadn't cast me out, I would never have met you." "Fate works in mysterious ways," Yates agreed, pulling her closer. "Though I like to think I would have found you somehow, no matter what." Grace smiled in the darkness. "My knight in dusty chaps, always," he promised, pressing a kiss to her temple. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity as they prepared for winter. Yates rode to Golden to complete the purchase of the land, returning with the deed that made their ownership official. Together, they repaired the cabin's roof and shutters, stocked the root cellar with provisions from town, and made plans for spring planting. Cookie stayed on, claiming he needed to ensure they were properly settled before seeking his own path. In truth, Grace suspected he had grown attached to them, viewing them as the family he had never had during his years on the trail. As October gave way to November, the first significant snowfall blanketed the valley. Grace stood on the porch, watching the silent transformation of their land into a wonderland of white. Yates joined her, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders. "Happy?" he asked, a question he still posed regularly as though amazed by his good fortune. "Completely," Grace assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Though I was thinking we should consider names for the baby." "Already?" Yates looked surprised. "We've got months yet." "It's never too early to plan," Grace replied with a smile. "I was thinking maybe Elizabeth for a girl after my mother, and for a boy perhaps James after your father." Yates's expression softened. "Elizabeth Cooper, James Cooper, both sound just right to me." Inside, Cookie was preparing a hearty stew for supper, the aroma wafting through the cabin's open door. The barn was filled with hay for the winter, the pantry stocked with flour and coffee and sugar. They had each other, a roof over their heads, and a future full of promise. For Grace, who had once been cast out with nothing, it was everything she had ever needed and more than she had dared to dream. As winter deepened in the Clear Creek Valley, the small cabin became a haven of warmth and love. Grace decorated their modest home with simple touches: curtains sewn from fabric purchased in Golden, pine boughs arranged on the mantel, a braided rug she crafted during long evenings by the fire. The place began to reflect their personalities, becoming truly theirs in more than just legal ownership. Cookie announced his intention to stay through the winter, to make sure you youngsters don't starve. But Grace suspected the old trail cook had found the home he'd been searching for as well. He took over a small lean-to attached to the barn, insisting he preferred his own space, but spent most evenings with them by the hearth, teaching Grace new recipes and regaling them with stories from his decades on the trail. "You two remind me of what might have been," he confessed one snowy evening after perhaps one too many cups of whiskey. "Had a sweetheart once back in Missouri, never did get around to marrying her before the war came." His weathered face softened with memory. "Sometimes I wonder what kind of life we might have built together." "It's never too late, Cookie," Grace suggested gently. "Perhaps when spring comes you could write to her." The old man shook his head, but there was a thoughtful expression in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Maybe so, maybe so." As Christmas approached, Yates rode into Golden despite threatening weather, returning with small gifts and the surprising news that a proper doctor had recently established a practice in town. He trained back east, Yates told Grace excitedly. Served as an army surgeon during the war. He says he'd be happy to attend to you when the baby comes. Grace placed a hand over her growing belly, relief washing through her. The nearest midwife was in Denver, and the prospect of having a qualified doctor nearby eased one of her few anxieties about their remote location. Christmas itself was a quiet but joyful affair. They exchanged modest gifts: a new hunting knife for Yates, a set of embroidery threads for Grace, a fine pipe for Cookie. Grace had managed to bake a small cake with precious store-bought sugar, and Cookie prepared a feast from a deer Yates had shot the week before. As they sat around the table, the cabin aglow with candlelight and warmth from the hearth, Grace felt a profound gratitude. This time last year, she had been serving Christmas dinner to the Hollisters and their guests, invisible except when needed, eating her own meal alone in the kitchen afterward. Now she was at the center of a family of her own making, cherished and valued not for her services but for herself. A toast, Yates proposed, raising his cup of cider, to new beginnings and the family we're building here in Clear Creek Valley. To family, Cookie and Grace echoed, their eyes bright with shared emotion. The new year of 1866 arrived with a heavy snowfall that isolated their homestead for several weeks. Yates kept busy repairing tack and tools in the barn, planning for spring planting and checking his trap lines for rabbit and fox. Grace's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though her growing belly made some tasks more challenging. Cookie took over more of the household duties, grumbling good-naturedly about delicate conditions, but watching over Grace with paternal concern. By February, Grace's thoughts turned increasingly to the baby's arrival. With Yates's help, she transformed the small storage area off their bedroom into a nursery, filling it with a cradle Yates crafted from aspen wood, tiny garments she sewed from soft flannel, and a colorful quilt pieced together during long winter evenings. "It's becoming real, isn't it?" Yates remarked one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting on the prominent curve of her stomach, feeling the baby's movements beneath his palm. "Very real," Grace agreed, placing her hand over his. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," he admitted with a soft laugh. "But excited too." "I never thought I'd have this, Grace, a home, a wife I adore, a child on the way. After my parents died, I figured I'd spend my life alone." Grace turned her head to study his profile in the dim light. "And now I can't imagine life any other way." He propped himself up on one elbow, gazing down at her with such tenderness it made her heart ache. "You've given me everything I never knew I needed, Grace Cooper." "Funny," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "I was just thinking the same about you." As March melted into April, bringing the first tentative signs of spring to Clear Creek Valley, Grace's time drew near. The doctor from Golden, Dr. Samuel Thornton, rode out to check on her, pronouncing her healthy and the baby well-positioned. "First babies often take their time," he advised before departing. "But send for me at the first sign of labor. Barring a spring blizzard, I can be here within hours." The baby, however, had plans of its own. Grace awoke in the pre-dawn hours of April 12th to the unmistakable sensation of her waters breaking. Yates, instantly alert at her gasp, needed only one look at her face to understand. "It's time," he asked, already reaching for his clothes. Grace nodded, a mixture of excitement and apprehension washing over her as the first contraction tightened her abdomen. "I think so, but it's just beginning. There's time to fetch Dr. Thornton." Yates was torn, reluctant to leave her but knowing the doctor's expertise would be invaluable. In the end, it was Cookie who solved the dilemma, appearing at their bedroom door in his nightshirt, awakened by their voices. "I'll ride for the doctor," he volunteered. "Yates needs to stay with you." Grace's labor progressed steadily throughout the morning. Yates remained by her side, supporting her through each contraction, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, murmuring encouragement when the pain threatened to overwhelm her. "You're the strongest person I know," he told her as the contractions intensified. "You can do this, Grace." Cookie returned midday with Dr. Thornton, who quickly took charge of the situation. Under his calm direction, the final stages of labor proceeded as smoothly as such things can. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Grace gave one final, tremendous push, and their child entered the world with a lusty cry that filled the cabin. "A son," Dr. Thornton announced, placing the squalling infant on Grace's chest. "A fine, healthy boy." Tears streamed down Grace's face as she cradled their son, marveling at his perfect tiny features, the tuft of dark hair that already resembled Yates's, the strong grip of his miniature fingers around her own. "James," she whispered, looking up at Yates, who stood beside her, his own eyes wet with emotion. "James Cooper." "Hello, James," Yates said, his voice rough with feeling as he gently touched his son's cheek. "Welcome to the world, son." In that moment, as the three of them huddled together in the golden light of evening, Grace knew that her journey had come full circle. From the lonely, accused maid fleeing Kearney with nothing but a carpetbag and her dignity, to this, a woman surrounded by love with a husband who cherished her, a son who needed her, and a home built with their own hands. The spring of 1866 brought new growth to Clear Creek Valley, not just in the natural world. As wildflowers carpeted the meadows and aspens unfurled tender green leaves, but in the lives of the Cooper family as well. Little James thrived under the doting attention of his parents and his honorary grandfather. Cookie, who had long since abandoned any pretense of temporary residency, constructed a proper cabin for himself near the main house, though he still took most meals with the family and spent evenings on their porch, smoking his pipe and watching the sunset paint the mountains in spectacular hues. True to his word, he had written to his long-ago sweetheart in Missouri, discovering that she was widowed but still remembered him fondly. Their correspondence grew regular, and by early summer, Cookie was making noises about a trip east to settle some long, unfinished business. Yates's careful planning during the winter months bore fruit as their homestead developed. He planted wheat and corn in the fertile soil beside the creek, established a vegetable garden twice the size of the previous one, and added 2 milk cows and a small flock of chickens to their growing menagerie. Grace threw herself into homemaking with the same determination that had seen her through the cattle drive. She learned to churn butter, preserve vegetables, and manage the 1,000 tasks that made up a frontier woman's life. In the evenings, with James sleeping peacefully in his cradle, she would often sit on the porch with Yates, watching the changing light on the mountains and marveling at how far they had come. "Do you ever miss it?" Yates asked one such evening in late June. "The trail life, I mean." Grace considered the question. "Parts of it," she admitted. "The open sky, the sense of adventure, the camaraderie of the outfit," she smiled, glancing toward the cabin where their son slept. "But this is better, building something permanent, watching it grow day by day." Yates nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking," he began, reaching for her hand. "The Barton outfit's looking for a trail boss for a short drive in August just to Cheyenne and back. Good pay, experienced cowboys." Grace studied his face, recognizing the barely suppressed longing in his eyes. "You want to take it? Only if you're comfortable with me being gone for a few weeks," he hastened to add. "You and James come first always." Grace squeezed his hand. "You should do it," she said firmly. "The trail's in your blood, Yates, and it would be good for us financially." Relief and gratitude washed over his features. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she replied. "Cookie will be here and we'll be fine for a few weeks." "Besides," she added with a teasing smile, "absence makes the heart grow fonder, or so they say." "My heart couldn't possibly be any fonder of you than it already is," Yates countered, pulling her close for a kiss that still made her pulse quicken, even after nearly a year of marriage. July brought a surprise visitor to Clear Creek Valley. Grace was hanging laundry on the line, baby James napping in a basket nearby, when the sound of an approaching horse caught her attention. Visitors were rare enough that she immediately called for Yates, who was working in the barn. The rider, a young man in the smart uniform of the Western Union Telegraph Company, reined in before their gate. "Mrs. Cooper," he called. "Mrs. Grace Cooper?" "Yes, that's me," Grace replied cautiously, shading her eyes against the summer sun. "Telegraph for you, madam." He extended an envelope. "From Kearney, Nebraska Territory. Had to ride out special to deliver it. Your homestead's not on our regular route." Grace accepted the envelope with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. News from Kearney could hardly be good. What could the Hollisters want now? Yates appeared at her side as the messenger departed, his expression concerned. "What is it?" "I don't know," Grace replied, breaking the seal on the envelope and unfolding the telegram within. The message was brief, but astounding. "To Mrs. Grace Cooper, stop Mrs. Hollister past stop guilt over false accusations cited in final days. Stop left you substantial bequest. In will stop please contact Edwards & Sons attorneys Kearney at earliest convenience stop. Regards Sheriff Johnson, substantial bequest." Yates read over her shoulder, his eyebrows rising in surprise. "What do you suppose that means?" Grace shook her head, stunned by the news. "Mrs. Hollister dead." The woman who had accused her of theft, who had cast her out without a second thought, had apparently carried guilt over the incident to her grave, enough guilt to include Grace in her will. "I don't know," she finally answered, "and I'm not sure how I feel about it." Over the next few days, Grace grappled with mixed emotions about Mrs. Hollister's unexpected legacy. Part of her wanted nothing to do with the woman's money. Hadn't she told the sheriff months ago that no compensation was required? Yet another part recognized the practical benefits such a bequest could bring to their growing homestead. "It doesn't have to be a burden," Yates counseled as they discussed the matter. "Think of it as an opportunity to secure James's future, to build something that will last for generations." In the end, pragmatism won out. Grace sent a reply to the attorneys in Kearney, providing their location and expressing willingness to discuss the bequest. The response came swiftly. Mrs. Hollister had left Grace the sum of $5,000, an amount so staggering that she had to read the telegram 3 times to believe it. $5,000, Yates breathed when she showed him the message. "That's more than I've earned in the past 10 years combined." "What should we do with it?" Grace asked, still trying to comprehend the figures. Yates thought for a long moment, then smiled. "Let's expand. Buy the adjacent parcel to the north. Jenkins has been looking to sell. We could run more cattle, maybe even start breeding horses like my pa did." The vision he painted was compelling. Not just a homestead, but a proper ranch. Something that would support them comfortably and provide an inheritance for James and any siblings who might follow. By the time Yates departed for the Cheyenne cattle drive in early August, plans were already in motion. Jenkins agreed to sell his undeveloped land, effectively doubling the size of their property. Yates arranged for lumber to be delivered for expanding both the main cabin and the barn, work that would begin when he returned in September. Grace watched him ride away with a pang of separation, but also a profound sense of security that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. She was no longer the desperate maid fleeing false accusations. She was Grace Cooper, wife, mother, and co-owner of what would soon be one of the most promising ranches in Clear Creek Valley. The weeks of Yates's absence passed more quickly than Grace had anticipated, filled with caring for James, harvesting the garden's bounty, and planning the expansion of their home. Cookie remained a steadfast presence, though he spoke increasingly of his own plans to travel to Missouri once Yates returned. "Martha, that's my sweetheart, she's agreeable to seeing me again," he confided one evening. "Says she never did find another man who could make biscuits worth eating." Grace smiled at the old cook's bashful expression. "I think she's interested in more than your biscuits, Cookie." He blushed like a schoolboy, tugging at his beard self-consciously. "Well now, that remains to be seen." September brought the first hints of autumn to the valley. Cooler nights. Aspen leaves beginning their transformation from green to gold, and with it, Yates's return. Grace heard the hoofbeats before she saw him, stepping onto the porch with James in her arms, her heart quickening at the sight of her husband riding toward home. He looked trail-worn but vibrant, his face breaking into a smile that outshone the sun when he spotted her waiting. Before the horse had fully stopped, Yates was dismounting, crossing the yard in long strides to sweep both Grace and James into a tight embrace. "I missed you," he murmured against her hair. "Every day, every hour. We missed you too," Grace replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Welcome home." That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, James sleeping contentedly on his father's chest, Yates told her about the drive, the challenges overcome, the satisfaction of a job well done, the generous payment that would add to their growing nest egg. "But the best part was knowing I had this to come home to," he concluded, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "A year ago, I couldn't have imagined how complete my life would feel." Grace leaned into his embrace, her heart full. "From nothing to everything," she mused. "Sometimes I still can't believe it myself." The autumn of 1866 was a season of transformation for the Cooper homestead. With the funds from Mrs. Hollister's bequest and Yates's earnings from the Cheyenne Drive, their expansion plans proceeded rapidly. The main cabin doubled in size, gaining a proper kitchen, a larger bedroom for them, a nursery for James, and even a small parlor where Grace proudly displayed the few treasures they had acquired: a set of leather-bound books, a china teapot, a framed drawing of their original cabin that a traveling artist had sketched in exchange for meals. Cookie departed for Missouri in October, promising to return in the spring one way or another. They stood together in the yard as he mounted his mule, the old cook uncharacteristically emotional as he bid them farewell. "You two gave me more than a job," he told them gruffly. "You gave me a family when I needed one most." He glanced at little James, who watched curiously from Grace's arms. "You make sure that boy remembers his grandpa Cookie." "We will," Grace promised, tears welling in her eyes, "and we'll be waiting for you in the spring, you and Martha both." As winter settled once more over Clear Creek Valley, the expanded Cooper household prepared for their first Christmas in their newly enlarged home. Grace, determined to make the holiday special despite their relative isolation, spent weeks baking, sewing gifts, and decorating with pine boughs and berries. Yates, catching her enthusiasm, disappeared one morning after breakfast and returned hours later dragging a perfect spruce tree, which they erected in the parlor and adorned with paper stars, strings of dried berries, and small carved wooden ornaments that Yates crafted in the evenings. On Christmas morning, they exchanged gifts by the light of the fire: a new shawl for Grace, a fine leather journal for Yates, and for James, now crawling and beginning to pull himself up on furniture, a wooden rocking horse that his father had secretly made in the barn. As they sat together enjoying a breakfast of special holiday bread and preserves, a knock at the door surprised them both. Visitors were uncommon even in good weather. In winter, with snow blanketing the valley, they were almost unheard of. Yates opened the door to find a young man in a mail carrier's uniform, his horse stamping impatiently in the yard. "Mr. and Mrs. Cooper?" he asked, consulting a letter in his gloved hand. "Special delivery from Kearney, Nebraska. Had to make quite a detour to find you folks." Grace exchanged a puzzled glance with Yates as he accepted the letter. What more could possibly come from Kearney? The envelope bore the official seal of the sheriff's office. Inside was a brief note from Sheriff Johnson himself, and with it, a smaller envelope addressed simply to Grace in elegant feminine handwriting. The sheriff's note explained, "Mrs. Cooper found this among Mrs. Hollister's personal effects. It appears to have been written shortly before her passing but never sent. Felt you should have it. Respectfully, Sheriff Thomas Johnson." With trembling fingers, Grace opened the second envelope. The letter inside was written in a shaky hand so different from the commanding script she remembered from Mrs. Hollister's household instructions, but still recognizably that of her former employer. "Dear Grace, by the time you read this, if indeed you ever do, I will have passed from this world. The doctors say it is my heart, weakened beyond repair, but I wonder if perhaps it is simply justice for the hardness with which I lived my life. I write to make what amends I can for the grievous wrong I did you. The brooch was found months ago, tucked into the lining of my jewelry box where I had apparently placed it myself and forgotten. My mind has been slipping these past years, though pride prevented me from acknowledging it. The money I have left you in my will is poor compensation for the injustice you suffered, but it is all I have to offer. My husband objected strenuously to its inclusion, which gives me some small satisfaction in my final days. I was not kind to you during your years in my household. The truth, which I can admit now at the end of my life, is that I resented your youth, your quiet dignity, the way the household ran more smoothly under your care than it ever had under mine. It was easier to view you as a servant than as a young woman worthy of respect. I do not ask your forgiveness, as I have done nothing to earn it. I merely wish to acknowledge the wrong and hope that life has treated you more fairly since you left our household. With belated regret, Alina Hollister Grace lowered the letter slowly, unexpected tears blurring her vision. Mrs. Hollister's words offered no excuses, no attempt to minimize the harm done, only a straightforward acknowledgement of wrongdoing and regret. "Are you all right?" Yates asked gently, concerned by her tears. Grace nodded, handing him the letter to read. "I never expected this," she said softly. Not an apology, not this level of self-awareness. Yates's expression grew thoughtful as he read the letter. "People can surprise you," he finally said, "even at the end of their lives." "It doesn't erase what happened," Grace mused, watching James play contentedly with his new rocking horse. "But it does help me leave it in the past completely." She took the letter back, folded it carefully, and placed it in her keepsake box, not because she needed Mrs. Hollister's words, but as a reminder of how far she had come from that desperate day on the road outside Kearney. The new year of 1867 arrived with a fresh blanket of snow and news that changed their lives once more. A letter from Cookie, delivered by a passing trader, announced that he and Martha had married in a small ceremony in Missouri and would be returning to Colorado in the spring, not just to visit, but to stay. "Martha's got ahead for business," Cookie wrote in his cramped handwriting. "Says Golden needs a proper restaurant, and who better to run it than an experienced trail cook and his wife who managed a boarding house for 20 years. Grace read the letter aloud to Yates, both of them delighted by the news. "I told you he was interested in more than his biscuits," she laughed. Yates grinned, bouncing James on his knee. "Good for Cookie, he deserves happiness." The winter months passed in peaceful contentment. Grace discovered she was expecting their second child, due in late summer. The news filled Yates with even greater determination to build their ranch into something substantial, a legacy for both their children and any others who might follow. Spring arrived in a riot of wildflowers and new growth. Cookie and Martha appeared as promised, the old cook looking years younger with his neat beard and new wife on his arm. Martha proved to be a practical, good-humored woman who immediately won Grace's affection with her no-nonsense approach to life and her obvious devotion to Cookie. "He talked about you folks so much, I feel like I already know you," she told Grace as they prepared lunch together on the day of their arrival. "Said you made him remember what family feels like." The two couples quickly established a routine of Sunday visits, alternating between the ranch and the small house Cookie and Martha had purchased in Golden, where they were indeed planning to open a restaurant catering to the growing population of miners, ranchers, and travelers passing through. As summer approached, the Cooper Ranch, now officially named Clear Creek Ranch, with a handsome sign erected at the entrance to their property, continued to thrive. The additional land they had purchased was fenced for grazing, a small herd of cattle established, and Yates had acquired 3 quality mares with the intention of starting a horse breeding operation alongside their other ventures. In July, as Grace's pregnancy advanced, they received unexpected visitors. A wagon bearing the Bar None brand, the outfit that had employed Yates for the cattle drive where he and Grace had met, rolled up to their gate one afternoon. To their astonishment, Harrison Wells himself stepped down, accompanied by several cowboys Grace remembered from the drive. "Cooper," Wells greeted Yates with a handshake. "Your place is looking prosperous." "Can't complain," Yates replied cautiously. "What brings the Bar None this far north?" Wells glanced at Grace, who stood on the porch with James balanced on her hip. "Actually, I've come with a proposition. The outfit's expanding our operations. Looking for a permanent trail boss to oversee multiple drives each season, someone who knows the business inside and out." He cleared his throat. "Thought of you first, Cooper." The offer was generous: a substantial salary, a stake in the company's profits, the opportunity to help shape one of the territory's largest cattle operations. But it would mean long absences from home, months on the trail each season, missing precious time with his growing family. Yates promised to consider the proposal, and the Bar None party continued on after sharing a meal at the Coopers' table. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk, Yates sought Grace's counsel. "It's a remarkable opportunity," she acknowledged. "The money alone would secure our future." "But I'd be gone for months at a time," Yates pointed out, his expression troubled. "I'd miss so much James growing up, the new baby." He reached over to touch her rounded belly. "I'm not sure any amount of money is worth that." Grace covered his hand with her own. "What does your heart tell you?" she asked simply. Yates was silent for a long moment, gazing out over the land they had cultivated together. "That I've already found what matters most," he finally said. "That I'd rather build something here with you than spend my life on the trail away from my family." The certainty in his voice confirmed what Grace already knew, that the ambitious trail boss who had once lived for the freedom of the open range had transformed, just as she had, into someone who valued roots and permanence above all else. The next morning, Yates rode to Golden to send a polite refusal to Wells and the Bar None. When he returned, there was a lightness to his demeanor, as though a weight had been lifted. "No regrets?" Grace asked as they walked together along the creek that evening, James toddling ahead of them, investigating every stone and stick with boundless curiosity. "Not a single one," Yates replied, slipping an arm around her waist. "This is where I belong." In August, their family grew once more with the arrival of Elizabeth Cooper, born under considerably less dramatic circumstances than her brother. Dr. Thornton attended the birth, pronouncing mother and daughter perfectly healthy before accepting a celebratory glass of whiskey with the proud father. Cookie and Martha arrived the following day, bearing gifts for the new baby and enough food to feed the household for a week. Cookie, who had initially seemed intimidated by the tiny, red-faced James, now handled the newborn Elizabeth with surprising confidence. "Had some practice with this one," he explained, nodding toward James, who was showing Martha his collection of special rocks. "Figured out they don't break as easy as they look." As autumn painted the aspen groves gold once more, Grace often found herself pausing in the midst of her daily tasks, overwhelmed by the fullness of her life. Looking around at their expanded home, their growing children, the ranch that was becoming known throughout the territory for its quality horses and cattle, she marveled at how completely her circumstances had changed in just 2 short years. From a maid cast out with nothing but a carpetbag and the clothes on her back, she had become the co-creator of a legacy that would endure for generations. The false accusation that had seemed like the end of her world had instead been the beginning of everything she'd ever needed or wanted. One evening in late September, as the first chill of autumn crept into the air, Yates found her standing on the porch, gazing at the sunset painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Elizabeth slept in a basket nearby, while James's childish laughter drifted from inside where Cookie was entertaining him with exaggerated tales of life on the trail. "Penny for your thoughts," Yates said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. Grace smiled, leaning back into his embrace. I was just thinking about that day outside Kearney when the Hollisters were chasing me and you appeared like some hero from a storybook. She turned in his arms to face him. Did you have any idea then what we would become to each other? Yates considered the question, his storm-gray eyes warm with affection. I knew you were special, he admitted. Something about the way you held yourself with such dignity despite your circumstances. But no, I couldn't have imagined all this. He gestured toward their home, their land, their sleeping daughter. You've given me more than I ever dreamed possible, Grace Cooper. And you, she replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly, gave me everything I ever needed. As the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long shadows across Clear Creek Valley, Grace and Yates stood together on the porch of the home they had built, surrounded by the life they had created from nothing but courage, hard work, and love, the most valuable currency of all. For Grace, who had once been a maid cast out with nothing, it was more than enough. It was everything.